Okay, it looks like so far so good. I'm assuming everybody can hear me, and I will go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Samantha Hooker. I'll be the moderator for today's Eval Cafe. The cafe is a longstanding speaker series hosted by the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan. The series aims to encourage a deeper dive into all things evaluation. As I said, I've added links in the chat. You can join our Eval Cafe mailing list to stay in the loop. There's also a link to our upcoming fall schedule, so you can register from presentations right from that. And we hope to see you at future presentations. Before we begin, we do like to take a moment to acknowledge the history of the land we're on. Western Michigan University is located on the ancestral lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, which was historically occupied by the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, and we honor their stewardship and connection to this land. Today, we're excited to be joined by our very own Megan López. She is a Senior Research Associate with the Evaluation Center at WMU. She works on Evaluate, an evaluation capacity development initiative funded by the National Science Foundation. She conducts and oversees research on evaluation capacity building and supports the development of open access resources. Her research and practice areas of emphasis include organizational and evaluation capacity building, STEM education, sport for development, youth developmental, and population health spaces. If you have questions during the presentation, you may enter them into the chat at any time, or you can use the reaction button to raise your hand. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Megan.
All right, thank you so much, Samantha. I'm going to take a moment to share my screen and make sure it looks right. So just bear with me for a second. All right, show meeting. All right, we can see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, that was good. First things first. So hi, everyone. I am really excited to be here and have the opportunity to present today at the Evaluation Cafe and to get to share findings that have been taking place over the last couple years across a bigger undertaking and collaborative effort. Today, I'm going to be presenting on evaluating evaluation capacity building, or ECB for short. And how insights from practitioners and researchers can be leveraged to advance how we approach, practice, and understand ECB. My name is Megan López, and I'm a Senior Research Associate at the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan, as Samantha said. And specifically at the Evaluation Center, I work on the Evaluate grant, which is Evaluate is the evaluation hub for the Advanced Technological Education Program by the National Science Foundation. And we are, a large evaluation capacity initiative that really works to advance evaluation in this grant community by offering trainings, cultivating a network, researching emerging topics as it relates to ECB and evaluation, and collecting data about this large program. Although I'm going to be presenting solo today, I want to acknowledge Lyssa Becho, who's the Principal Research Associate and PI of Evaluate. And she was right alongside me with this work, co-authoring and co-editing a lot of the work all the work co-editing and co-authoring some of the work that I'll be sharing. This is a good time to note that the views expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. So the content that I will be sharing out derives from the conclusion of a new directions for evaluation that Lyssa and I guest edited that aims to reflect on and strengthen the field's understanding of promising efforts to evaluate ECB initiatives. If you're not familiar with New Directions for Evaluation, it's a quarterly source book that's published by the American Evaluation Association. Each issue is devoted to a specific topic within the realm of evaluation. This issue is now officially newly released online as of last week, which we are really excited about. And if you subscribe to it, will be coming to your mailbox soon, but it will also be fully available open access. A few are currently open access, and we're in the process of making sure the rest are open access as well. So if you don't see it now, please continue to check back and it will be up for everyone. And with that, we would like to briefly say thanks and acknowledge the support received from the editors-in-chief, Dr. Sarah Mason and Bianca Montrose-Moorhead, who were extremely helpful throughout the development of this issue. And then, of course, for the 32 authors who are represented in the issue across its 8 articles, please note that any one that I name, I'll say just like the last names of the authors, but I'm specifically referring to the work that they published on in this issue. And at the very end of the presentation, I'm going to share the QR code and a link so that you can dive into their amazing work further. But before we get too deep into the content of this presentation, I want to start by sharing my own experiences and perspectives that really shape how I share this work and why I'm so excited to present it, as I keep saying. My hope is to help ground why thinking about ECB differently is important for any of us engaged in evaluation at all. So, as we hear all too often in this field, I perhaps fell into the field of evaluation accidentally. But if that's true, then I absolutely fell into evaluation capacity building accidentally. I actually started my career as a clinical social worker at a federally qualified health center in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I was in that health center because of a SAMHSA grant, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. I truly loved my clinical work. I thought it was so important and impactful. But because of this, I learned that what I was really passionate about was how programs could be leveraged to make meaningful change on individual and community levels and the overall systems that people are a part of. So because of this, I chose to pursue my PhD in population health at Northeastern University, where I had the privilege to work in their public evaluation lab, providing evaluation services to smaller nonprofits and programs in the Boston area. Simultaneously, I was and still am leading a small sport for development nonprofit that aims to build access to sport and the many biopsychosocial emotional benefits associated with movement, physical activity, and community building. Now, super frustratingly, up until recently, I, who identified as an evaluator, did not have the time, resources, or capacity to evaluate this nonprofit that I knew was doing really important and impactful work in my community. You know, we had a volunteer staff. We really just had enough resources to do the programming well, but not to evaluate it and then leverage that to grow our impact. But while I was working at the evaluation lab in Boston, I learned that many other community-based nonprofits had the same experience. And for all of us, without having that capacity to evaluate our work, we were struggling to be competitive in an increasingly competitive funding environment, which perpetuates our overall capacity challenges. So, although my attempts to evaluate my own organization and my evaluation work with other community-based organizations were not inherently evaluation capacity building projects, I realized that in order to be a good steward of the resources these organizations were devoting to evaluation, such as their time, personnel, money, they should leave any time-bound evaluation project, or really any project at all, with the ability to make evaluation routine within their organization, regardless of their ability to hire or contract with an evaluation for long periods of time, and to grow that important work. So all this to say, I approach this work with the perspective of an evaluation capacity builder who knows how important and crucial it is, but also with someone who just truly understands how hard it can feel to do this work meaningfully. So regardless of your relationship with ECB today, whether you call yourself an ECBer or not, I hope that this presentation conveys that the idea that building our knowledge around what effective ECB is can build the field of evaluation as a whole. And for those who are actively working to build ECB, I hope to share ideas, some inspiration, tools, and tips that will help you evaluate ECB, conduct research on the evaluation of ECB, and share your own promising practices and findings out broadly. If you are tired of hearing me say evaluation of ECB, I apologize because I'm going to say it about 100 more times. And then I'm also going to throw in research on evaluation on ECB in there too. So it's just part of the work. And then I'm also using a construction theme because it's appropriate to building and development, but also because of my 1-year-old who is obsessed with construction, as most 1-year-olds are. And so that's the world we're thinking on all the time. So very briefly, this presentation is going to take place in 3 sections. First, I'm going to ground the presentation in a little bit of background, so how we're thinking about ECB and why we started this work. Then I'm going to share some key lessons we have learned about evaluating ECB. And I'll conclude with some future directions for research and practice, as well as a call to action. We'll certainly have time for discussion and questions at the end. I will say that any questions about specific articles that I'm sharing would be best left to the authors themselves, who I don't think are here, but that we'd be happy to connect you with. But would love to hear your own experiences, your own contributions, things that have worked, questions you have for maybe other people doing this work, anything like that. So let's briefly detour to acknowledge that there are other terms than ECB commonly used in our field, such as evaluation capacity development or strengthening, and there are many ongoing conversations around the distinctions between these terms. However, for the purpose of this work, we asked authors to use the vernacular true to their individual settings, but did not apply meaningful differences between the terms. So I'm going to be using ECB. And when I think about ECB in this work, we're talking more broadly about it using the 2002 definition by Stockdale and colleagues that describes it as a context-dependent, intentional action system of guided processes and practice for bringing about and sustaining a state of affairs in which program evaluation and its uses are ordinary and ongoing within and or between one or more organizations, programs, and sites. And to focus the scope of this work a bit, we chose to separate ECB from informal evaluation capacity development, such as that which happens naturally in a participatory or an empowerment evaluation approach, and the formal education of students, such as capacity development that happens in an academic program or certificate. These are both areas that merit their own specialized time and attention, and we wanted to pare it down a bit. Okay, so how did this work come about? Let me grab a quick drink of water. It really started over 20 years ago when ECB became recognized as an essential effort in growing the field of evaluation. We as a field realized that the more people who are conducting, consuming, and commissioning program evaluations, the more we are understanding the possibilities and promise of evaluation, and then ultimately the more impactful those evaluations can be. With this recognition, we witnessed an increase in research on the practice of ECB across those last 20 years, as demonstrated by Bourgeois and colleagues. And as we become increasingly interested in ECB, we're realizing that it's equally important to grow our understanding of how to evaluate the effectiveness and impact of those efforts. Many before us have identified the need for more evaluation of and research on effective ECB practices and what that impact actually looks like. And while many have published on this, the literature up until this point had really largely been dominated by self-report or case study methodologies. This is all extremely important work and have made great contributions, but it also presents an opportunity to expand how we evaluate and research evaluation of ECB. So in doing so, we can gain a better understanding of how to do the work, what to measure, which approaches to take, and a lot more. And ultimately is an important step to increasing the quality of ECB, leading to more meaningful and useful program evaluations. So to that end, Lyssa and I proposed to guest edit the issue of new directions for evaluation. And while we were unsure how many were out there both thinking about evaluation of ECB and doing the work, but prepared to publish on it, we were pleasantly surprised that our call for authors received over 30 article proposals, all of which were extremely interesting and of really great quality. And so this really speaks to the fact that as a field, we're responding to this call and we're well positioned to do so. So with that, I'm going to share the 3 primary lessons learned, highlighting some examples presented in the articles within the NDE issue. I'm going to warn that I can only scratch the surface of the important findings presented within each article. So to get the full scope, please check out the issue as a whole. All right, so our first lesson is that ECB is complex, but evaluating ECB doesn't have to be. As Lyssa and I read through the initial article proposals, we laughed that so many of the ECB initiatives were, like all of which were diverse in scope and aims and settings and audiences, were described by the authors as being complex. And the reason why we laughed is it's because it was the same way we were describing our own initiative. You know, like it is so hard to figure out how to evaluate this because it's complex. And it just really highlighted the fact that we're all kind of in the same, we're all having some like similar questions. We're in the same boat. So the questions we often hear that relate to this complexity might ask, how do I establish impact when audiences come in and out at different intervals with varying levels of capacities? How do we establish a return on investment when ECB activities or my work with this initiative is time bound? Of course, if it didn't already feel daunting, we must recognize that the challenge of how to evaluate ECB is then further complicated by the realistic constraints of when and with what resources can I do this. But several authors in this issue help us to understand that evaluating something complex doesn't have to be complex itself. Instead, we can place boundaries and structures that facilitate systematic ECB evaluation and then result in relevant learnings that are useful and actionable. Bob Williams, who's one of the authors in this issue, was describing his work, and he joked that the way they approached it, they mapped out their entire ECB system. They identified the parts of the system that they felt were most important to establish impact. And then they got rid of the rest, which was most of it. And while he was joking, the ECB initiative described by Williams and colleagues was quite complex. It was emergent, so it didn't have predetermined activities, and it focused on a very large and diverse region, Latin America and the Caribbean. It aimed to create a state where evaluations were commissioned, implemented, and put to use by individuals, organizations, and a society as a whole, which is not a small feat. So to evaluate this, they found that setting boundaries around the scope of their evaluation was an essential first step to come out with meaningful findings. But in doing this, they recommend prioritizing what matters most to the initiative's key interest holders. In their case, they chose to bound the ECB system into 2 subsystems, one that focused on capacities to do and the other that focused on capabilities to use evaluation, which acknowledges that different interest holders perceive the evaluation differently based on their interest within the ECB initiative, some falling more in one subsystem than the other. They then developed frames to use as the lenses through which this program was evaluated, all of which were based on what mattered most to each interest area. And these are the ones that are highlighted in yellow. And 2 examples here include the project framing, which examines lessons learned from individual projects and the outcomes that can be gleaned from that. And the institutional framing examined collaboration and partnership within the ECB initiative. In another article, Rux and colleagues describe how they applied and altered the Kirkpatrick model, which I'll show in the next slide, to break down their ECB initiative's outcomes evaluation into smaller constructs across 5 different levels that build upon one another. So these levels and constructs include implementation and reach, satisfaction, learning, application, and impact. Under each construct, there are several outcomes that are included with data collection methods tied to each. As an example of a satisfaction outcome, the perceived quality of ECB activities and relevance to their own evaluation work were measured following webinars or other events hosted by the initiative. Under application and impact, evidence of professional exchange was then measured using social network analysis. Those are just two among many others. But they conclude that by structuring the evaluation around these levels and constructs, applying various types of data, such as monitoring and self-report and artifact, the results were a multitude of evidence that could be woven together to build a really strong, comprehensive story of impact. So to conclude this lesson that we've learned, or this takeaway, we want to remind everyone that the choices we make to systematically evaluate ECB through boundary setting and structure building simplify the complex task of ECB evaluation without making it overly simplistic. In doing so, however, we must acknowledge that these are in fact choices that are being made by people and therefore reflect implicit and explicit values and beliefs and biases that we hold. So when making the choices, let's consider the wants and needs and values of those who are involved, impacted by the ECB initiative, and to align the choices we make and actions to those, to ensure that it is most impactful, most useful, and really mirroring the values. Right. Our next takeaway is that ECB is highly context dependent, and its evaluation should be too. And I'm sure as evaluators, no one is surprised by this. The field has long stated that context awareness is integral to quality program evaluation, which leads to very useful and actionable results. The same could be said of ECB, which often involves initiatives unveiled over very long periods of time in evolving socio-political, cultural, economic contexts. This issue addresses the importance of considering dynamic contextual factors that influence, facilitate, and sometimes constrain ECB. For example, funding cycles and partner priorities inevitably change, as will the socio-political landscapes in which they occur. So while we advocate for structure within ECB evaluation, as we just talked about in the last takeaway, the importance of flexibility to ensure responsiveness to an initiative's evolving context is apparent. So Gomez and Arguras discuss monitoring changing context in order to remain responsive. As a component of their evaluation of an ECB initiative that had a dynamic participation base, so people coming in and out, all with varying levels of existing capacities, they implemented ongoing standardized data collection. And they did this so that they could learn about the audience's changing needs. And then they could take those findings and adapt and improve upon the initiative's activities or the way it's delivered in real time. Ultimately, they found that this improved the overall impact and relevance of their ECB initiative. In another article, Urban and colleagues present an updated set of rubrics that can be used to assess the quality of evaluation artifacts and discuss how these tools can be used to build and measure evaluation capacity. They discuss the strength of the rubrics and encourage users to customize them to best fit their own ECB initiative's context. In customizing and applying these rubrics to score ECB artifacts, such as like a logic model or theory of change, they recommend engaging in reflective discussions along the others doing that work to build context-specific consensus around expectations and standards of various evaluation artifact components. So as a final push, we think that this awareness and flexibility to context can have other benefits. Several authors in the issue discuss the importance of leveraging evaluation to grow and scale an ECB initiative, then tailoring the evaluation to support that growth. Funders, as we likely know, are increasingly prioritizing and allocating resources towards evaluation and ECB as a strategy to enhance their grantees' ability to measure and demonstrate impact, which leads to informed decision-making, resource diversification, and then can also ensure accountability of both the fundee and the funder. This is ultimately a trend that favors ECB practitioners and can be leveraged to sustain ECB evaluation into our work. And that's a really great segue into our final takeaway, and that is that evaluators, including researchers and practitioners, are not the only ones interested in ECB evaluation. We're not just doing it for our own interests and our own practice. But when we think of an ECB initiative and its interest holders that include the audience or participants, host organizations or programs, and those conducting ECB, we might less often think of governing bodies, policymakers, funders, brokers, and partnering entities, all of which that are interested in ECB evaluation. So this takeaway really extends what we've mentioned through others, and that's when we evaluate ECB, there are many interest holders who are both looking to learn from and stand to benefit from this work. Goodyear and colleagues demonstrate the benefit of considering a wider range of interest holders. They share an example of an ECB evaluation wherein the needs and goals of both recipients, organizations, as well as funders were discussed. Through this process, they moved away from viewing funders as a static resource and instead considered the dynamic ways in which funders of an ECB initiative influence the outcomes of that ECB. In this case, while they were working with grassroots organizations, they learned that many already had methodologically sound evaluations, but used methodologies that were unfamiliar to their particular funder review panels. And maybe here we're thinking about like a participatory-based approach or an empowerment-based evaluation approach. To respond to this, they shifted their ECB approach to focus on funder panels in adopting and supported them in adopting newer ways of understanding what it means to put together methodologically sound evaluation practices. But once again, as I've said a few times, when considering needs and interests and aims of various interest holders, we should remember that we are making choices that may benefit some while also marginalizing others. Martin and colleagues provide an example of unintentional harm stemming from evaluator choices. They posit that while the evaluator is likely interested in learning about skill development among ECB recipients, an over-reliance on measuring change in technical capacities or expertise may highlight recipient deficits rather than their actual learnings, particularly if those skill constructs do not align with the audience's starting capacities. Instead, they encourage evaluators to consider the multitude of non-technical capacity skills, such as communication and translational skills, and how those could be used to benefit evaluation capacity. This can better facilitate the development of findings and recommendations that can advance ECB in a given setting. So while we focused on considering distinct interests when evaluating ECB, we should also do the same while disseminating findings from an ECB initiative. It's important to consider who stands to benefit from findings of an ECB evaluation and how those findings can be leveraged to further those priorities. And while the primary interest holders should come first always in thinking about these efforts, those of us involved in this work selfishly hope that the secondary dissemination efforts will include learnings and recommendations for the field at large so that we really are all benefiting from it. So hopefully I have inspired you to evaluate ECB or continue the work that you're doing and conduct this research. And if that's true, we have identified a few ideas to help get you started based on this issue. First, we recommend leveraging evaluation or research on the evaluation of ECB to gain a greater understanding of an intervention's ability to achieve and sustain its intended impact. This is so important, reminded to us by Bourgeois and Buetti, who understand the many challenges that community-based organizations face in sustaining evaluation practices as a routine part of their operations. This is an important issue for us all, as these organizations have chosen to put their valuable resources towards ECB and stand to gain significantly when ECB is not only effective, but the effects of that intervention are long lasting and take into account the fact that there's staff turnover, that activities change, that funding priorities change. Wingy and colleagues provide a good example of how research and evaluation of ECB can be leveraged to examine sustainability of ECB outcomes through their longitudinal study that looks at changes in evaluation plans over a 14-year period among the initiative's targeted population. This study relied on non-self-report data rating characteristics of evaluation plans proposed to a grant program before and since the implementation of an ECB initiative. So here is a brief summary of the results that demonstrate that components of evaluation plans became more detailed over time across many of the components measured. And another strength of this study is that it can and is in the process of being replicated to continue to assess the initiative's impact, and then can be used to tailor offerings of that or improve upon or adjust in any way the offerings of that initiative. Our next recommendation is that we continue to broaden the lenses through which we evaluate or conduct research on the evaluation of ECB. Evaluation knowledge, practices, values, theories, methodological approaches, and tools are ever evolving. To keep up with this, we see increasing and continuous efforts within the field being made to incorporate modern concepts, emerging ideas, and historically underrepresented voices in our practices around the evaluation of ECB. Fortunately, many exciting and timely advances are being made in this area by researchers, practitioners, and evaluators, all of whom we're really excited to learn from. And I'm guessing you don't need another argument in favor of this, but Martin and colleagues remind us that the values held by these approaches and paradigms, such as like an Indigenous or youth-led evaluation approach, often align with the individuals and organizations receiving and commissioning ECB. Therefore, it is really time to build the evaluation tools within the ECB space that reflect these values, principles, voices, and ideas. And in our final recommendation, this issue identifies an overall need to conduct systematic, rigorous research on ECB evaluation. In her article that opens this issue, Conjori examines which conversations have been dominant in publications on ECB evaluation over the past several years and provide recommendations where research can push these conversations further. Ultimately, this echoes the sentiments of others, which is that we as a field will benefit from research on evaluation that examines approaches to ECB across diverse settings, disciplines, audiences, as well as ECB outcomes. I, for one, eagerly await the opportunity to learn from and apply the findings of these studies as they come out. All right, and so before we go into discussion or any questions that might come up, I want to conclude with 2 calls to action. From this work, it became abundantly clear that the desire to do, participate in, and facilitate ECB is strong and growing among researchers, practitioners, and evaluators, as well as policymakers and funders. Although that's not new information, learning that the field is also very interested in ECB evaluation research on it was a sharp contrast to how we were thinking when we started this work, when we weren't sure if there'd be enough people wanting to and ready to publish on it. So as such, we really urge the field to view ECB as an intervention. And as evaluators who evaluate interventions, we hope that the field increasingly views ECB as an intervention that is worthy of its own evaluation. And we further call for those engaged in this work to not only evaluate ECB, but to consider opportunities to publish their evaluation findings or conduct research on ECB evaluation. We recognize that there are realistic constraints placed on practitioners, which are funding, time, and deadlines, that might make responding to this call difficult. And we truly experienced that throughout the NDE, where people were so excited to publish on their work, but they're just not funded to do it. And they're so busy with the important work that they are doing. Fortunately, there are a growing number of entities that are dedicated to advancing this work. And so we hope that those doing the important ECB evaluation work can align to collaborate or partner with those who are in a position to facilitate research, publication, and dissemination efforts. In time, this is not only going to advance the work that ECB practitioners and scholars are doing, but can meaningfully support organizations and entities that are at the heart of ECB in growing their impact. So if you are interested in seeing the article, there's a QR code here, and then there's also a bit.ly link that will link to the NDE issue in the latest articles. Again, several of the articles, a few of the articles are open access right now. The rest will be open access, but of course, if you email myself or one of the authors, I am sure they will be happy to share their work. The more people who can read it, the better. And I would love to hear if anyone has their own experiences with this. Again, any questions for the authors would be best directed to them, so that they can really dive into their work. They are the experts, of course, of it. But anything that came up, we would love to hear about and talk about. I'll put the bit.ly link in the chat. Okay, that should work, Allison. All right. Let's see. So let's see, Brad said, I was surprised when you mentioned that all authors had described ECB as being complex. I think there are a lot of ECB as being relatively simple, things like promoting better data collection, providing logic models or other tools to understand their program, sharing basic question evaluation. My question is, do you think that this is unique to those who are evaluating ECB because of the scale or context that lend themselves to ECB evaluation? Is it because simpler activities that might constitute ECB are less likely to be viewed as interventions? I think, Brad, that is a really great question. And it kind of reminds me of, my initial anecdote at the beginning, where there's a lot of like simpler ECB interventions that might be viewed as more informal, that might not be considered, these like the intervention that an ECBer might be delivering. So many of the proposals that were submitted were talking about these larger scale initiatives, regardless if they were happening in smaller community-based settings, if they were looking at international partnerships, or trying to examine large policies. But then again, like those smaller initiatives, we didn't see as much focus on that. And I think that would be a really important area to think about. Yeah, and Kamal said, I think the challenge of complexity is about lack of resources. Not many funders want their donated monies allocated to admin or evaluation. Yes, and I think thinking from a smaller community-based organization, there really are not many funders who are funding evaluation within projects. There are more capacity building grants out there, but then that's, adding in a separate activity, right? It's not built in with the other types of funding.
Hi, everyone. This is Lyssa in the room at the Evaluation Center. I also wanted to add that when we're talking about complex here, we're really using that idea of complexity in relation to systems thinking. So this idea that relationships are really adaptive and unpredictable. If you think about how people learn, particularly professional adults who get information from a variety of sources, doing anything that's attributional around evaluation capacity development, it gets tricky. We also see that on a lot of larger, more formal ECB activities that you don't have people consistently attending, that you'll have some folks who just drop in for a 1 hour thing, some people who use resources, and some who are there all the time, right? So there's kind of also a dosage question there as well.
Thank you so much, Lyssa. Yeah, so Paul, thanks for your question. He asked, in the example of my own organization that I mentioned, can I describe what an ECB initiative might look like in that organization? And, I'll start with a very quick example here. Knowing how I'm as a leader of the organization, I happen to know how important evaluation is. And very fortunately, in this sport for development space, there's a really cool program called Hello Insight that provides pre and post surveys that are specific to youth development and sport-based programs. The cost for our organization to use this was $2,000, which is quite a large cost for an organization of our size with volunteer staff. So when I brought this to the board, for me, I was like, this is like a deal. This is so important. We're going to use these findings. I'm going to run with them. The board of directors was like, no way. That is way too much money. We're not doing that. Can you get them to go down on the price? It's not worthwhile. So evaluation capacity building in this sense required a lot of education, right? Coming back to the board, explaining the importance of it, explaining how the findings will be actionable and useful and how we'll leverage them to bring back greater resources for our organization and greater support. And then ultimately it involves building in evaluation to board meetings, to annual presentations on impact, to sharing how those findings contribute to refining our theory of change and all of that. So evaluation capacity building in that sense, right, really was building that culture of evaluation and greater knowledge of what evaluation is among non-evaluators, and is an ongoing effort. Let's see. Okay, did any of the articles or collectively impact how you think about or deal with evaluation capacity in your own small nonprofit or similar organizations? That is a really good question. I think ultimately, again, as I was just saying, it did help me think about that sustainability piece, right? As the example I just described, that can't end with me describing it one time, right? And saying, please give us this funding. It's now, into building it in routine and making sure that you talk about that importance of the culture and pulling that forward. I see Brad has his hand raised.
Thank you, Megan. Really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm really interested in this topic. It seems to me that one of the biggest challenges for ECB, you mentioned Williams and co-authors referencing the capacity to do evaluation as well as the capacity to use it. It strikes me that if we look at research on evaluation capacity building, we know a lot about the capacity to do evaluation. There's been a lot of direct approaches to ECB, and a lot of people have spent good time trying to understand and unpack, what happens there. But it strikes me that we know very little about the capacity to use evaluation, and how to bring that about. And I think it's really hard to study that. But I think from what I heard you saying about the Williams and others article, there may be some interesting insights from a systemic perspective to think about the capacity to use evaluation. And I'm just wondering, your impression about the rest of the volume. Is there anything else that really popped out for you in the volume that really speaks to the issue of how do we get at, either from a research point of view or an evaluation point of view, how do we get at, understanding the capacity to use evaluation?
I think that is a really good question. I also invite Lyssa to give any insights that she might have. I do think that what I thought was really interesting is that how that question like intersects with like funding landscapes and what funders are wanted. It was less addressed in the issue. And I think when we think about the funding landscapes that are asking for evaluation, they're asking for X, Y, and Z outcomes, the outcomes that they've often identified as important. Those are outcomes that especially smaller organizations are less likely to be able to leverage to further their own priorities. So even if funders are saying, like, we want you to evaluate and this is how, if they're saying and dictating what they need to report on, it's not really supporting that ability to use in the same way. So I do think, again, that furthering, right, the ability to use evaluation and building those capacities and evaluating it and researching it would be an extremely important route to go. And then that way, not only are we supporting the organizations, but we can leverage those to advocate back to funders, back to those larger systems that are supporting evaluation.
Thank you for that. Years ago, we kind of came up from our own research with a sort of a working hypothesis that kind of goes along the lines of, educational innovation. Belief follows practice. So getting teachers to use an innovation in the classroom through a combination of pressure and support. And then they get to see the benefits of the innovation through their own eyes and to encounter it that way. So in the same way, we call it data valuing sort of follows data use. So if we can kind of get organizations to embrace evaluation as a potential for leveraging change, if they actually experience successful use of it, it's going to arouse interest in that. And maybe, there's a kind of a spiral effect of integrating that into the organizational systems. So I'm just, I'm eager to read the article by Williams and others, but I'm wondering if we've made any further progress toward, understanding how we can get organizations to integrate evaluation into their work.
Yes, I think I would be really eager to see that work as well. And and I think especially smaller organizations, right, when you can see directly how it can impact your bottom line, it can bring in those resources. And in a lot of cases, it makes it so much easier. It's easier to ask funders for money when you have this story of impact, that when they ask, how are you going to tell me that this program was successful? And you say, here's my plan. Like, this is how we do it. And we're not just doing it because you're asking for me now. We do it because we care about knowing that impact. So I would love to see that work further and be a part of that work, truthfully.
This is Lyssa in the room again. I would add to that. I think when we started our call for authors for this issue, in my head, at least, there was this idea of like, oh, I'm sure other people have these questions answered, and I'm sure someone else is doing something that we don't know about and way better. And, this is going to be the issue that I wanted when trying to work with the external evaluators of our ECB project. And one of the things Megan and I certainly learned along the way is that as a field, we just aren't quite there yet in answering those questions. And so we really hope that this collection of articles can also help spark more people asking this question, and more people systematically evaluating their ECB efforts and then sharing that and publishing either their evaluation reports or publishing on that. And I know that that's not a satisfying answer to say, we need to do more and share more, but isn't that how it normally is?
Lyssa.
Megan, this is Lori. Do you see Fanny's question? Fanny's asking if ECB initiatives are context dependent, what variables should be considered before conducting such efforts?
Great question. I think one of the prominent lessons that came out, and it brings back questions to our own ECB work, is really around again, like funders and how interactive, right, can our relationship with funders be. One of the articles discussed how typically when we think about like a logic model of an ECB initiative, funders end up in that like resources or like context, and we kind of just view it as that like static entity, right? But funders are dynamic. And in some cases, right, you can't advocate back to a funder, but in others you can. And so like that is a really important place to start. What does that relationship look like? I was recently at the European Evaluation Association conference, and I heard from one initiative that takes place in the United States where they do work with smaller organizations, and they go back to funders and really advocate for evaluation that will most benefit those that are funded, and not the evaluation that the funder necessarily thought they wanted. And talking about why it's so important, right? And how everyone is really furthered when that evaluation is most meaningful. And then again, another one is more grounded with like the recipients of ECB, right? That they're changing, their rules are changing, the issues that, like the political issues that they're focusing on, the things happening in their community, that changes all the time. So being able to continuously monitor and adjust your offerings based on what's happening in the larger context that affect the people on the ground is extremely important as well. Trying to monitor the chat here.
I was just doing the same thing. We have time for one more question. If anybody has one, I'll just kind of give it a minute. Oh, there is. Paul is wondering if there's anything special going on at AEA, which is the American Evaluation Association conference in Portland, about ECB. It would be a good chance to talk about it.
That is a really good question. We had hoped to present on this, but unfortunately are not able to at the conference this year. But I wonder if anyone else knows of anything going on. I haven't actually had a chance to look at the program yet, but I'm really excited to do so. We will be at the conference though, and I would love to connect in person as well.
So we will be there, and I will go ahead. I'll put a link. It's a little off subject here, but I'll put a link in the chat where you can check out WMU's presence at the conference.
Okay, let's see. We have one more question here. Okay, because ECB is context dependent, stakeholder driven, and ongoing, how do we help our client organizations understand while short-term gains, milestones, etc., are important. They don't represent finality in the process, and that momentum and sustainability are important. That is a really, really, really good question, and it speaks to that future direction, right? Where sustainability of those outcomes is so important to examine further. Once you can establish, right, sustainability, or just the fact that there are a lot of processes, right? Like no one's leaving a single training with capacity, like just a lot of capacity, right? A lot of this capacity building, right, happens with experience, where you take X amount of trainings, resources that you found that were tailored to your context and your grant setting. You have conversations, you see it in action, right? There's a lot of that stuff that happens informally, but does continue to build upon your larger evaluation capacity building efforts and priorities. So I think thinking about sustainability, right, not just in terms of like, how was this training learned, applied, and shared with others, right? How does the portfolio of ECB initiatives, right, percolate, and how does it continue to grow individual capacities? And then how can we justify that back to the organizations who are commissioning ECB and the funders who are funding it? So really awesome question, but I think, again, is another area that requires some focus. And thank you, Salvatore. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Megan, and thank you for all of you for joining us today and your participation in our Eval Cafe. We'll hope that you'll join us for our next presentation. That will be on November 6th, featuring Sarah Mason. She's the director of the Center for Research Evaluation at the University of Mississippi. And her title has got my eye already. It's called You're an Evaluator, Research on Explaining Evaluators to Non-Evaluators. So hopefully you'll join us for that. Maybe we'll see you in Portland next week. And thank you so much again for your time today. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all. I put my email in the chat if you're interested.
Megan, go by. Oh, wow.
That makes me think when
Presenters aren't usually part of the debrief anyway.
I was a professor during